A couple of weeks ago, Hirak, the famous Algerian protestation movement that has sparked the country since 2019, celebrated its 2 years. The movement was fully led by Algerian citizens and was seen as a wave of hope. Many believed that they could change the status quo that they had long been stuck to after the Black Decade that destroyed the country in the 90s. But 2 years later, what has Hirak been able to achieve? And above all, what can we expect from it today? Hi, my name is Maya and welcome to this first episode of my channel where we discuss international, social and political issues. In today's video, we'll dive into Hirak to understand its origins, its evolution, and the current situation of the movement. Hirak, also known as the Revolution of Smiles, started on February the 16th, 2019, when people took to the streets in the city of Kherrata, Algeria, to protest against Abdelaziz Bouteflika's candidacy to a fifth presidential term. The protests then spread across the country, and on February the 22nd, 2019, the first massive protests were organized across several cities in Algeria, including the capital, Algiers. Bouteflika had been in power since 1999, right after the end of the Black Decade, which designates the 10 years during which Algeria had to go through a bloody conflict between the military and the Islamic party, the Front Islamique du Salut, responsible of killing thousands of people and organizing bombings and attacks. This came right after Algeria had organized its first free election with more than one party allowed to run in 1990 and left the country in a hopeless situation. Since coming to power, Bouteflika had been known for corruption and for wanting to hold on to power. Besides, his inability to govern had been growing as his health was being damaged, especially after he was victim of a stroke in 2013. Besides, he made very little public appearances, and thus people considered his candidacy to fifth term humiliating. However, their anger against Bouteflika was slowly transformed into an anger against what people label as le système, referring to the collaboration of the military and the government to control the country. They wanted to change the political status quo that Algeria had long been stuck to. On top of that, people also protested against massive unemployment, economic stagnation, and other systemic issues. Starting February the 22nd, weekly protests were organized on Fridays and Tuesdays afternoon. They quickly became the biggest protests that the country had ever known, especially in the capital, Algiers. The particularity of the Hirak was that it seemed to be apolitical. It was led by Algerian citizens and no leader really stood out. Besides, the protests were made easier by the use of social media, where people organized the protests and also shared information on how the movement was progressing. So what were the repercussions of this movement, and what exactly happened after February the 22nd, 2019? About a month and a half after the protests started, Bouteflika announced his resignation to a fifth term on April the 22nd, 2019. The presidential elections were then pushed back to July the 4th and then December the 12th. This was seen as a ray of hope, but it was then quickly shattered by governmental responses to the protests. Upon Bouteflika's resignation, General Gaid Saleh, a prominent military chief in the country, started to take over most decisions and supervised waves of arbitrary arrests during the protests, often shattered by unnecessary police violence. New rules, often arbitrary, regarding protests were instigated by the government, such as the prohibition for protesters to wear the Amazigh flag. Their strategy was not only to arrest as many citizens as they could, but it was also to divide the Algerian citizens, as they knew that the main strength of the movement resided in their unity. However, on December the 12th, 2019, Abdelmadjid Tebboune was elected president of the country despite wide opposition and a very undemocratic electoral process, as the official turnout was of only 39.88%, but according to some opposition parties, it could have been as low as 8% only, as most Algerians refused to head to the polls, arguing that Tebboune was a substitute for Bouteflika. The second biggest blow to the Hirak was the constitutional referendum organized in November 2020, aimed at respecting the Hirak's demands. But then again, very few people headed to the polls, arguing that while those who stayed in power remained the same, the referendum would not matter. Nonetheless, it was still passed. Now, in between this, COVID also affected the protests. Since COVID started, most protests have gone online, but arrests have not stopped. Many journalists, students, or activists have been arrested for the content that they post on social media regarding Hirak. Khaled Ralani, a journalist for TV5 Monde, was arrested for undermining national unity and was then freed about 2 weeks ago. Rachid Nekez, a prominent businessman and political leader, was also arrested several times and imprisoned for his involvement in the movement. These are only two of the most famous examples among others, but according to Amnesty International, at least 300 people have been arrested since the beginning of the protests, and many of them are victims of police violence during the arrests and during their detention. Most of these arrests are based on very blurry motives that most Algerians believe to be trumped up and aimed at undermining the Hirak. Since the protests were affected by COVID, and since many people are being arrested, what can we expect today from the Hirak? Is the movement bound to stop? Predicting the exact future of the Hirak is actually hard to do. However, it seems that the movement is not bound to stop. On February the 26th, 2021, a little more than 2 years after the first protest started, thousands of Algerians gathered energies to show that the movement had not died down. However, reaching the movement's goals will probably prove harder to do, as the old system Algerians have been so long fighting against seems to remain in place. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to give it a like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to follow my Instagram if you want to have daily videos on international news. I will see you soon for another video.